Peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. Whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul.
Who are you? When did you become you? Why did you become you? When did you know who you really were? Those are the main questions in our character studies that we're doing. Who are you? Go ahead and take a moment. Who are you? Who am I? What do we do? What have we done? What are we going to do in the future? I believe in studying the characters of the Old Testament reveals principles for us to live by each and every day. Not because they were in the Old Testament. I believe a study of the New Testament individuals who lived during the New Testament age can give us principles we can live by. But these individuals lived in a different time. They lived among different people. They were different people. Think about how much time has changed in just the last 1,000 years. Times are different. And what we learn about these individuals, they face the same problems we do. Problems have slightly changed. They've become electronic. Our problems are constantly with us. We pull out our phones, problems are always with us there. Society, what does society still say? Society still says no to God. But people, let's describe our individual for our study tonight. You already know who he was from our scripture reading. He was a man, according to Daniel 10:11 and Daniel 10:19, who was beloved of God. He's a man, as you read from Genesis to the end of the Bible in Revelation, no ill word was spoken of him. That was true. I'm not saying someone didn't set him up and say, look at what Daniel's doing. I'm saying no one spoke an ill word toward him because it was true. Ezekiel 14:14 sets him forth as an example of righteousness. Here's what we learn, and we're just going to go ahead and say it outright. Daniel stood for what was right. And I think if we put a tagline, a phrase, a theme on the life of Daniel, it would be a man that stood for what was right. Even in our scripture reading, for Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. Have you ever considered what you're going to do in life? Daniel had. Even many times before it had happened. Have you ever considered what might happen in your life? What's going to happen to you tomorrow? What's going to happen to me tomorrow? Where are you going tomorrow? Many of you going to work. Many of you have other things to do. Some of you have doctor's appointments. Where are you going to be? In the world. What's in the world? Sin. Guess what? The world that Daniel lived in was very much the same. But things were different for Daniel. He wasn't a free man. We can say right now we have freedom. Every one of us is in this room. We're free. In the country in which we live, we're free. Not oppressed in any way, even though many times we feel we are. We're worried about future impressions or imprisonments. Daniel wasn't. So remember that as we go through our study. I've thought about how we could break down the book of Daniel multiple times and how we can study the life of Daniel. And it's really hard when you try to take one individual and in 28 minutes, here was his life. With Daniel being so short of a written book, I want us first of all to get the contents of what's happening in each chapter. Just quickly, just briefly, we're just going to walk through each chapter and see what happened in Daniel's life during the time in which it's being written about. Then we're going to make about 7 different observations. And then we're going to get to a point that I think is crucial. The results. Why did all of this happen? Why was it important for us to look at all of this? The results. And in the point which we're looking at the results or the success of Daniel, we need to ask a question. Can I do that? Can I do what Daniel did now? And that's why we're making these character studies. Can I be, or do I dare to be, a Daniel? Go to Daniel 1. Let's begin chapter 1. Nebuchadnezzar has invaded Jerusalem. And among the captives are Daniel and all of his companions. In chapter 1, we learn that Daniel and some of his fellow friends, his companions, were selected to train for the king's court. That means that of everyone that was taken in Jerusalem, Daniel and his friends were chosen to serve in the king's court, serving under King Nebuchadnezzar. What was he to do? I know many of you already in your mind's eye know what's coming. Remember, he refused to eat the king's, I think the word is dainties. He refused to eat the food of the king because he knew that's not good for me. What was he to do? He's a captive. Look at Daniel 1:8. This is the passage that was read, and we're going to come to Daniel 1:8 multiple times tonight. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. You know what Daniel chapter 1 teaches us? Maybe we need to make requests of our world. And I won't have to be put in a position where I have to defile myself. That can happen in a number of things. But Daniel made remarkable progress under the kingship of Nebuchadnezzar. And that's where we find in Daniel chapter 1, verses 17 through 21, Daniel had wisdom, and he moved through the kingdom rapidly. Look at chapter 2. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And this was a dream that he didn't understand. It's a dream in which break him from his sleep. We look at verse 2. The king commanded all the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans for to show the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king. Guess what? They couldn't show him. Out of everybody the king had at his disposal, nobody could tell him what his dream was. You ever been woken up in the dead middle of the night and you couldn't remember what you were dreaming about? There's the king. And the king wanted to know, what was I dreaming? Look at verse 3. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. I know this was important, but I can't remember it. Daniel is the one who was requested in verses 14 through 18, and he is the one who's able to, after communion with God in prayer, tell the king his dream. But not only could he tell the king his dream, he was able, as we look at the rest of the chapter, all the way down to verse 49, interpret this dream. Here's what we learn from Daniel chapter 2. Daniel 1, make requests of our world. Daniel 2, pray. Pray. We remember 1 Thessalonians 5:17 real easy. It's a short verse. Pray without ceasing. That means in every obstacle, every occasion of life, pray. And Daniel furthered himself in that kingdom. Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar sets up that great image. He told everyone, bow down and worship it when you hear the blast of the instruments. 3 men. Can you name them in your mind? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. 3 men, no. They were not, and they knew that the book of the law of God said, do not bow down before any man or an image of a man. Here's King Nebuchadnezzar. Here's Jerusalem in captivity. Bow before me. He made this big image of gold. He had a fiery furnace, and God's servants were put in it. They would not bow to that king. You know what happened because these 3 men decided not to bow down before this king? King Nebuchadnezzar praised the God of these men. Chapter 3, here's what we learn. Stand up for what's right. Stand up for what's right. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. He's troubled in it. Daniel tells him in this dream, because that's who Nebuchadnezzar goes to. He's already interpreted his dream once. Not only just interpreted, remember in the previous chapter, chapter 2, not only interpreted but told him. Now he tells him the dream and Daniel interprets the dream. Here's what we learn in chapter 4. Daniel has to tell the king, in which he is captive of, in which has obeyed all of Daniel's requests and even granted him special privileges to do such. Daniel has risen in his kingdom. He's got to tell this king, you're going to lose your kingdom for a while. That's tough news to deliver to someone. That's tough news to deliver to a king who can have you killed. You didn't bring bad news to the king. Here's Daniel. Here's the interpretation of. And he gives such to the king. Remember, the king was destroyed for pride for 7 years, but it would be restored back unto him. You know what we learned from chapter 4? Tell the truth. Tell the truth. That seems so simple, doesn't it? Tell the truth. Chapter 5, Belshazzar makes a great feast during which he sees the handwriting on the wall. That's so familiar to us. We use it so many times in children's classes, and they can remember seeing that hand on the wall. Daniel tells him, your kingdom's going to be taken from you again. And Belshazzar's slain. You know what chapter 5 is about? Keep telling the truth. Keep telling the truth. You can tell the truth for a little while, but can you keep doing it? Chapter 6, Darius the Mede, he's next in the throne, and he is scheming. He has this idea he's going to overthrow some, and a plot's given against Daniel. Daniel 6 is the lion's den. That's very familiar to our minds. Daniel's praying. We've already made one of the chapters a theme of praying. Daniel chapter 6 is do what's right. Do what's right. Daniel gets thrown in that lion's den, but he's protected. But you know what happened after Daniel did as God would have him to do? King Darius, now on the scene, praises the Lord of Daniel for what he had done. Chapter 7, in the first year of Belshazzar, Daniel sees a vision of 4 beasts which represent the 4 kingdoms talked about in chapter 2, a very short particular chapter. In Daniel chapter 8, he's going to have another vision in the 3rd year of Belshazzar. He sees the Medo-Persians being destroyed as a he-goat. When we keep on going down in the chapters, Daniel chapter 9, specific references are going to be made to the times regarding the Messiah. Daniel prays to God and he confesses his sins and those of the people. We've studied this before in a sermon, and we talked about Daniel chapter 9 and the prayer that Daniel made. Daniel chapter 9, if we gave it a theme, bear it all to God. He told everything he could think of and confessed it to the Lord because he knew that's how I make it right. Daniel chapter 10. Daniel receives another vision, and he receives encouragement which is going to prepare him for chapters 11 and 12. It's really a quiet chapter of the book, chapter 10. It's preparing him. In chapter 11, there's wars between the kings of Egypt, which is called those of the south in the book. And then the kings of the Assyria, or of Syria, not Assyria, kings of Syria, those of the north. This is all taking place. Daniel's living in the midst of war. Haven't we lived in the midst of war before? What did that do to America every time war has been present? Whether it's on United States soil or we send our troops somewhere else, it destroys morals. It destroys our view on life, and so many innocent lives perish. Guess what? Daniel lived in a time in which the north and the south are fighting, and they're stuck right in the middle. It's also the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, which is described as the little horn in chapter 11. And he campaigns against Egypt, and the persecution of God's people ensues during that time. That's a dark day, chapter 11. But somehow in the midst, we can call chapter 11 surviving. Surviving. Chapter 12, a command is given. It's time to close the books, Daniel. I think it's important for us to look at all these 12 chapters, just even in brevity as we've done, really quickly, because we start to see what happened in Daniel's life. There are all these other people that Daniel's connected to. There are all these other things that are happening, and guess what? Daniel survived. And not only did Daniel survive, but so did so many others. So there's the content of the book of Daniel. Let's make some observations about Daniel himself. We need to remember Daniel's life and what we call Daniel's ministry when he was serving for God bridges the entire 70-year period of the Babylonian captivity. That's what we're talking about in the text of what's happening from chapter 1 all the way to the end. He's bridging that gap. They're in captivity. Imagine this. You've been deported, and you've been taken to another culture, around other people. You're 900 miles away from home. Would we survive? I want to ask you a question. How many of us would give up and die? It happened to people. But Daniel, somehow, through the midst of this, is selected to become someone in the king's house. And he's selected by God to be the mouthpiece of God, declaring God's present and eternal purpose. Something else just to notice about observations of the book. 9 of the 12 chapters revolve around dreams about trees, animals, beasts, and other images. There are a lot of things happening in the book of Daniel. Daniel and his 3 friends were evidently born into Judean families. They were, number 1, young men in which were no blemish found. Number 2, they were still good looking. Number 3, they were gifted, according to the book of Daniel, talks about in all wisdom. Number 4, they possessed knowledge. And number 5, they were quick to understand. That's in Daniel chapter 1, verse 4. And I want us to take a moment to pause in the life of Daniel for a moment. How many times when we're talking about Daniel do we only talk about Daniel? Daniel was raised to be Daniel. Daniel was raised to be Daniel. Daniel was gifted in all wisdom. He was trained in that. Daniel possessed knowledge. He was trained in knowledge. And that happened before he was in the king's house. Daniel 1 verse 4. Daniel was raised to be Daniel. Sometimes people ask, well, how do we raise good children? You know what phrase I give? I don't know. But I know people throughout history have done it. I know, just like when I read here in verse 4, somebody did this. We forget to think about Daniel's parents. He had a good family. Daniel was given 3 years of training, according to verse 5, in the best schools that Babylon had to offer. As a part of that re-identification process that happened as they were taken captive, they were given a new name. Daniel's name, Belshazzar, is interesting to us. Daniel didn't need a false god. Daniel served the one true and living God, and it's interesting, it's really perplexing to me that Babylon gave him the name Belshazzar because Bel is found in the name, and that name was supposed to be used as Bel protects Daniel. That's what Babylon thought. But Daniel didn't need the god of Baal. Daniel's wisdom and divinely given abilities brought him into a position of promise, especially in the courts of Nebuchadnezzar and both Darius themselves. So not just through one division, through two. 3 times when we think about Daniel, he's mentioned in the 6th century contemporary Ezekiel as an example of righteousness. Ezekiel 9:23, Ezekiel 10:11, and Ezekiel 10:19 all show Daniel was a depiction of righteousness. Now, all of that brings us to a lot of thoughts, but I want to bring them down into one unique thought about Daniel. Daniel's life is described as such: a life of faith, a life of prayer, a life of courage, a life of consistency, and a life that was full of lack of compromise. You want to be a Daniel? Have faith. You want to be a Daniel? Pray. You want to be a Daniel? Get some courage. You know how you get that? It's right here. You want to be a Daniel? Dig deep. You want to be a Daniel? Be consistent in what you do. You want to be a Daniel? Stop compromising. You know what's different about us and Daniel? We have this. We have this. That's what's different. Daniel was able to do somehow all of this without a great roadmap of life. That's what I like to call the Bible as a whole, roadmap of life. He did it all without this. And sometimes we're so down on ourselves that we can't survive. I've heard this one a million times. We'll never make it. How about this one? We've done that before. You always have to add to that phrase, and it didn't work. Somehow Daniel made it. And somehow we think we can't. In our observations of the life of Daniel, we see he survived. He didn't just survive, he flourished. Let's think about, just briefly, 6 things under the success. The success. Go back to Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. That's where we have to begin when we think about the success of Daniel. In our character study of Daniel, what we've noticed is he was great. He knew what was right, he knew what was wrong, and he avoided it at all cost. Here's the big question. How? Daniel 1:8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. You want to live a life that's acceptable to God? Tell yourself you're going to. You want to be faithful? Tell yourself you're going to be faithful. You want to be here Wednesday night? Go ahead right now. I'm going to be here Wednesday night. You want to start praying more? Start praying more. He purposed his life. He gave his life purpose because he put God in it. The success Daniel purposed in his heart. Go over to Daniel chapter 6. Let's notice the next thing. Daniel chapter 6. We're going to notice 2 things from Daniel chapter 6, verse 4. We read here, the presidents and the princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could not find none occasion, nor fault, for as much he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Number 1, we looked at Daniel's purpose in his heart, Daniel 1:8. Number 2, Daniel was faithful. Do you know what's not different about us and Daniel? People are watching us just as much as they were watching Daniel. There was no fault found in him. You want to know why? He put God in his life and he purposed not to be found in fault. He was faithful. But number 2, we learn from verse 4, he was blameless. They couldn't even make something up and say, this is what we think Daniel did. You know what they had to do in Daniel chapter 6 to get Daniel to mess up? They had to get the king's pride on their side. Have the king make that decree so that way no one could pray to anyone but the king, because they knew Daniel was going to pray to the God of heaven. How great it would be if we lived lives where people knew, no matter what the United States does, I'm going to pray to the God of heaven. How different would we be? I'm talking about myself too when I make that statement. How different would it be if everyone knew, no matter what happened, Jonathan is going to pray to the God of heaven? You want to know why Daniel survived? He worked at it. Look at Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. Now when Daniel knew the writing was signed, he went into the house, his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Daniel purposed in his heart. Daniel was faithful. Daniel was blameless. And Daniel prayed and praised God as he did aforetime. Doesn't matter. I think Daniel is an excellent lesson of the United States. And what I mean by that, the Christian that lives in the United States. It may be within the next few years that we cannot preach true marriage. Will we? Will I? Will you support me? Will you support any preacher that preaches what's in the New Testament? That may be where we're going, but guess what? We'll survive. Somehow. Don't know how it is yet. We'll make it. If we'll just stay true to what's here. That's what Daniel did. It didn't matter what they said. It didn't matter if he had to upset his king. He prayed to God 3 times with his window open so everyone could see it. He didn't hide it. I'm going to go ahead and tell you right now, we can't hide our Christian life. Can't. You know what would have happened if Daniel closed his windows and prayed? It would have been just like not praying. Because he would have been cowering behind mankind. I don't have to do that with the Lord. Look at verse 16. We're going to learn something else about Daniel. So Daniel purposed in his heart. Daniel was faithful. Daniel was blameless. Daniel prayed and praised. Verse 16. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. Daniel kept serving God. And it was so much so that the king of the time realized, number 1, I've made a mistake. Number 2, I'm throwing a man of God in a pit full of lions. And number 3, Daniel, your God will save you. How would it be if we lived our lives so everyone knew that our God would save us? No matter what we came into contact with? How would the world deal with Jonathan who cannot be destroyed? Yep, they may destroy me physically, but I'm going to last in eternity with heaven. I don't know about you. That's where I want to be. And if you're not sure you're going to be there, make that declaration to yourself tonight, and you make it right with the Lord, and you be there. That's what Daniel would do. Look at Daniel chapter 6, verse 23, and let's get the last thing in Daniel's keys to success. And this one, I believe, is one we need more and more. If there's anything we need, I think it's right here, Daniel 6:23. Then the king, exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. Daniel trusted God. If there's something we need right now, it's trust in God. You're having financial problems? It'll be okay. I don't know how it's going to be okay. You pray to God and you trust Him. You're having marital problems right now, it's going to be okay. It is. You pray with your spouse and you trust God. Having problems with your kids? I don't have children right now that are physically running around. Not long. Pray to God. Pray with them. Having problems with some church folk? Ask them to pray, and you trust God. Having some problems with your boss at work? You know what will shock that man? You ask him if you can pray with him. And that'll say more than you've ever said in your life. Daniel lived so that when he came out of that den, it was written and penned about him. It was because he trusted and believed in God. 6 things Daniel purposed in his heart. Daniel was faithful. Daniel was blameless. Daniel prayed and praised God. Daniel served God no matter what. But Daniel had faith in God. We're going to do just like we did this morning. We're going to end where we began. Who are you? When in the world did you become you? Why did you become you? When did you know who you were? I think this may be the most crucial point of our night. Do you need to change you? Nathan's going to lead us in the invitation song in just a moment. And when that song's being sung, everyone in this room has one responsibility. You better check your life. And if it's not right or you have doubt, take it to the Lord. That's what we're here for, isn't it? We're here to be a family of God. What better time would it be than making it right now? I don't know what your spiritual condition is. If you're not a child of God, I want to encourage you something. You'll never regret it. From here to eternity, if you will put God's word in your mind and you will purpose in your heart not to defile yourself, you'll never be left standing. I wish I didn't do that. And you do it God's way. I don't care what man has said. I don't mean that disrespectful to man. The Bible tells us how to come unto God. And if you've not done it biblically, you've not come unto God. If you are a child of God tonight and you realize, my life's not right. You know, there are many things that can keep our lives from being right. Looked at a lot of them in the book of Daniel tonight. I don't know what it is, but we're going to sing this invitation song. And while we do, you think. If anyone has a need, why don't you come and together we stand and sing.
When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea